The Conclave of Ascended Voices was the oldest gathering place in the known galaxy, a station so massive that it had its own weather systems inside its halls, and on this day it was full of noise and pride and the smell of 1,000 alien species who believed they ruled the stars. 4,000 civilizations had sent their representatives here, creatures of every shape and color and size, beings made of crystal, and beings made of smoke, and beings with so many eyes that looking at them made your head spin. And all of them believed the same thing, that the universe was theirs to divide and control as they saw fit. At the center of the great chamber sat the ruling council, led by High Arbiter Kelvothan, a towering insectoid of the Drethi species whose armored body clicked and hummed with every movement he made. And beside him stood Fleet Marshal Saravan Kal of the Thari Dominion, the most powerful military force the galaxy had ever produced. Reptilian creature, covered in golden scales, who wore his medals like a second skin, and smiled at everyone the way a predator smiles at something small. Today they were here to vote on the Boundary Expansion Accord, a document that sounded very official and very reasonable, but was in truth a simple thing. The Thari Dominion and its allies wanted to take control of the Outer Rim systems, and many of those systems belonged to a species called humans. Humans had only been part of the Galactic Communion for 82 years, which in galactic terms was less than the blink of an eye, and most species in the chamber did not think about humans at all, and the ones who did think of them thought of them the way one might think of a child who had wandered into a room full of adults, small, harmless, and not worth worrying about. Ambassador Tyrell Nix represented humanity in this chamber, and she sat in her seat with her back straight and her dark eyes watching everything. When the time came for objections, she stood and spoke in a voice that was calm and clear, and carried no anger at all. She told the conclave that the accord would strip human colonies of their sovereignty, that families who had built lives on worlds like Kepler's Reach and New Svalbard would lose everything they had worked for, and that this was not security restructuring, but theft dressed in legal language. The chamber listened the way one might listen to a bird singing outside a window, briefly and without real attention. Fleet Marshal Kal laughed, and it was not a quiet laugh, and he said that perhaps the humans should be grateful that the Dominion was offering them protection at all, considering how small their fleet was and how little they had contributed to galactic affairs. Several delegations laughed with him, and the sound filled the chamber like rolling thunder, and Ambassador Nix stood in the middle of it all, with her expression unchanged. Nothing more, because she knew that words would not save her people today. The vote was called, and it passed with an overwhelming majority, and the accord became law, and the outer colonies of humanity now belonged on paper to the Thari Dominion and its allies. But then something happened that no one expected. In the far corner of the chamber, in a seat that had been empty for 600 years, something moved, and every voice in the room died at once, because they all knew who sat in that seat, even if most of them had never seen him move before. Vorethi Sal, the last living elder of the Kaluni, the oldest species ever recorded in galactic history, rose from his chair, and the sound of his life support tendrils dragging across the floor was the only noise in a room that held 10,000 beings. He was ancient beyond understanding, over 11 billion years old, and his body showed every single one of those years. His skin was thin and translucent, could see the slow pulse of light, moving through veins that had carried blood since before most stars in this galaxy had been born. And his eyes were deep and dark and filled with something that was not quite sadness and not quite anger, but was instead the terrible weight of having seen everything and being believed by no one. He spoke, and his voice was like wind moving through the bones of a dead world, soft and dry and impossible to ignore. He told them a story. He said that long ago, before most of the species in this chamber had learned to walk upright, he had watched a small blue world spinning around an unremarkable yellow star. And on that world, he had seen something that had frightened him more than anything he had encountered in 11 billion years of life. He had seen a species born on a planet that tried to kill them every single day. A world of earthquakes, and volcanoes, and ice ages, and plagues, and predators with teeth longer than their arms. Instead of dying the way they were supposed to, instead of going quietly into extinction the way 1,000 other species had done on 1,000 other death worlds, they had done something impossible. They had gotten angry, and they had turned that anger into survival, and then into dominance, and then into something that had no name in any galactic language, because no other species had ever done it before. They had taken a world that wanted them dead, and they had conquered it so completely that they had reshaped its very climate and geography to suit their needs. He paused and looked across the chamber, and every eye and sensor and receptor was fixed on him. He named them humans. He said that the beings in this chamber saw humanity as children because they were young among the stars, but he warned them that youth and weakness were not the same thing, and that he had watched civilizations far older and far more powerful than the Thari Dominion burn themselves to nothing by making the same mistake they were making today. He told them that rage was woven into human blood like a second helix of their DNA, and that they carried inside them a fire that had been burning since the first human picked up a rock and decided that the predator chasing them was going to die instead. He begged them, and it was the first time in recorded history that a Kaluni elder had begged for anything, to void the accord and leave humanity alone. "You are reaching into the cave of something you do not understand," he said, and his voice shook, not with weakness, but with fear. "When it wakes, it does not negotiate, it does not relent. It simply destroys until there is nothing left to destroy." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then High Arbiter Kelvathan thanked him with the kind of respect one gives to a grandfather who has told a story that is very interesting but not very relevant. And Fleet Marshal Cole smiled his predator smile and said nothing at all, and the accord stood, and the vote was final. Ambassador Nix did not speak again, and she did not argue, and she did not shout or cry or beg the way some delegations expected she might. She simply stood from her seat and looked across the chamber one last time. And then she turned and walked out, and her footsteps echoed in the silence she left behind. Vorethi Sal watched her go, and he closed his ancient eyes, and he whispered words that only this life support system recorded. "So it begins again." Nix boarded her shuttle alone, and as the great station shrank behind her, she opened a priority channel to Earth, the kind of channel that only existed for moments when everything else had failed, and she sent a single message in a voice that was perfectly steady and perfectly cold. They voted yes. Wake the Forge. 18 months after the accord was passed, the Thari Dominion arrived at the human colony of Kepler's Reach, with warships in the sky and soldiers on the ground, and a message that said this world now belonged to them. The ships were enormous, dark and gleaming, built to intimidate, and they hung over the colony like storm clouds that would never pass. And the Thari soldiers who marched through the streets were tall and scaled and armed with weapons that could melt stone. And they expected the humans to do what every other species had done when the Dominion came knocking, bow their heads and accept what was happening. They were wrong. Captain Jonah Marin stood at the window of the Colonial Defense Headquarters and watched the Thari troops move through the main square below. And his face showed nothing at all, but his hands were tight at his sides, and his jaw was locked in a way that anyone who knew him would have recognized as dangerous. Earth's Reclamation Wars, a conflict that most galactic species had never heard of because it had happened on a single planet and involved only humans fighting other humans, but it had been one of the most savage and brilliant military campaigns in human history, and it had taught Marin things about his own species that kept him awake at night. He knew what humans could do when they were pushed, and the Thari had no idea what they were pushing. The occupation was meant to be peaceful, at least on paper. The Dominion called it administrative integration, which meant they would take control of the colony's government, its resources, its infrastructure, and its people. And in exchange, the humans would receive the generous protection of the Thari military whether they wanted it or not. Overseer Kreth was the Thari officer assigned to manage the transition on Kepler's Reach, and he was a mid-ranking bureaucrat with compound eyes and mandibles that clicked when he was annoyed, which was increasingly often, because the humans were not cooperating. They were not fighting either, and that was the part that confused him most. No one rioted, no one threw stones, no one shouted insults at his soldiers. The humans simply went about their lives as if the Thari were not there at all, and when they were given orders, they found quiet and creative ways to not follow them. Supply shipments arrived late, or not at all, because the docking systems kept experiencing technical malfunctions that no Thari engineer could trace, and the power grid developed strange fluctuations that shut down Thari equipment but never affected human buildings, and workers in the mines and factories slowed their output to a fraction of what it should have been, without ever technically breaking a single rule. It was resistance turned into an art form, silent and patient and absolutely maddening, and Kreth began to feel something he had never felt before on any deployment, the unsettling sense that he was not the one in control. He reported his frustrations to the Dominion Command, and they told him to be patient, that the Communion did not want an incident with such a young and politically insignificant species, and that if he could not manage a handful of primates on a backwater colony, then perhaps his career was not as promising as he believed. Meanwhile, far from the occupied colonies, far from any system that the Galactic Communion had ever surveyed, something was happening that would have terrified every species in the galaxy if they had known about it. On Earth, in a facility buried so deep beneath the surface that it did not appear on any map, Director Lena Vasic stood in a room filled with screens and holographic displays and watched the feeds from every occupied colony with eyes that did not blink and a face that showed nothing at all. Vasic was the head of the United Earth Directorate's most secret division, project codenamed The Forge, and she had spent 40 years of her life preparing for exactly this moment, the day the galaxy looked at humanity and saw something small and easy to take. The Forge was not one facility, but hundreds, scattered across dead moons and rogue planetoids and asteroid fields that no alien sensor had ever scanned. And inside them, humanity had been building something that the Communion would never have believed possible. For 82 years, since the day humanity first joined the galactic community, Earth's brightest minds have been quietly studying every piece of alien technology they could get their hands on. And not just studying it, but improving it, redesigning it, pushing it past limits that the original builders had never imagined, and then hiding the results where no one would ever look. The Forge had produced weapons and ships and systems that existed nowhere else in the galaxy, not because humanity was smarter than every other species, but because humanity had one advantage that no other species shared. They had spent their entire history fighting for survival against a universe that did not care if they lived or died, and that had made them very good at building things designed to kill. The crown jewel of the Forge was the Wrath Fleet, hundreds of dreadnoughts and thousands of support vessels, all of them hidden in the dark spaces between stars, all of them crewed by soldiers who had trained for years in secret, all of them waiting for a single word from Earth. Captain Marin received a coded message that arrived through channels so secure that even the colony's own communication system did not register it, and the message was short, and it said, "Hold the line. Help is coming. When it arrives, step aside." He read it once, and then he deleted it. And then he went back to the window and continued watching and waiting. 6 weeks into the occupation, Overseer Kreth made the decision that would set the galaxy on fire. He had been pressured by the Dominion command to produce results, and the humans' quiet resistance was making him look foolish, and his frustration had been growing like a poison in his blood. And when a group of human colonists gathered outside a children's hospital that the Thari had seized for use as a supply depot, he decided that what the situation needed was a demonstration of authority. He ordered his soldiers to disperse the crowd. The colonists did not move. He ordered his soldiers to fire warning shots. The colonists still did not move. And then someone gave an order. Kreth would later say he did not give it, but the records would show otherwise. And Thari soldiers opened fire on the crowd, with weapons designed to melt stone. And when the screaming stopped and the smoke cleared, there were 47 humans lying dead on the street in front of a building that had been built to take care of children. 13 of the dead were children themselves. The news traveled fast, faster than light, carried by emergency channels that burned through every relay between Kepler's Reach and Earth, and within 1 hour every human being alive knew what had happened. Earth did not erupt in anger the way the Thari expected. There were no riots, no mobs, no screaming crowds burning effigies in the streets. Instead, something far more terrifying happened. The entire planet went quiet. It was a silence that had a weight to it, a silence that pressed down on everything like gravity had doubled. And it was not the silence of grief or shock, but the silence of something ancient and terrible, waking up behind the eyes of 8 billion people at once. In her facility beneath the Earth, Director Vasek watched the footage from Kepler's Reach, and she watched the bodies being carried away, and the blood being washed from the street, and the Thari soldiers standing over the dead with weapons still hot. And her expression did not change at all, because she had always known this moment would come. Not hoped for it, not wanted it, but known it the way you know that winter follows autumn. She picked up a comm unit and opened a channel to every hidden shipyard and secret base and training facility that the Forge had built, over 40 years of patient and silent preparation. And she spoke one word into that channel. Just one, in a voice that was perfectly calm. Go. And across the dark and empty spaces between the stars, in places that no galactic survey had ever found, lights began to appear. First dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Engines igniting in the void like stars being born. And the Wrath fleet moved for the first time. And it moved together. And it moved with purpose. And it moved toward the beings who had killed their children. 2 weeks after the massacre on Kepler's Reach, the Galactic Communion released an official statement expressing its deep concern about the incident, and recommending an independent inquiry to determine whether the use of force had been proportionate. That was all. No sanctions, no punishment, no consequences of any kind. Just words arranged in the careful and meaningless way that powerful institutions arrange words, when they want to appear to care without actually doing anything. And in the private halls behind the conclave chamber, several delegations whispered to each other that the humans had really brought this upon themselves through their uncooperative behavior, and that perhaps a firm hand was exactly what such a young species needed. Ambassador Tyrell Nix watched the statement being read from her seat in the gallery, and she listened to every word, and when it was finished, she stood one final time before the assembled representatives of 4,000 civilizations and delivered the shortest address in the history of the conclave. "We came to you in peace," she said, and her voice carried through the vast chamber without amplification, because every being present had gone silent the moment she rose. "We asked only to be left alone. You answered with the blood of our children. We will not ask again. We will not address this body again. The next time you hear from humanity, it will not be with words. She walked out of the chamber, and behind her a pair of attendants removed her chair, physically unbolted it from the floor and carried it away, and the empty space it left behind seemed to grow larger with every passing second, and several of the younger delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats because there was something about the way she had spoken that did not sound like the complaint of a weak species. It sounded like a promise. In the days that followed, something strange began happening across every communication network in the galaxy, and the first person to notice it was a young Valesi intelligence analyst named Shorai. The Valesi were an avian species known for their obsessive attention to detail, feathered beings with sharp eyes and sharper minds, who had turned the analysis of data into something close to a religion. And Shorai was one of the best among them. She had graduated at the top of her class and been assigned to the Communion's Central Intelligence Bureau, where she spent her days monitoring the communication traffic of every member species. And 2 weeks after the massacre, humanity's traffic vanished. Not decreased, not reduced, not shifted to encrypted channels. It simply stopped. Every diplomatic frequency silent, every trade channel dark, every civilian broadcast gone, as if someone had reached out and turned off every transmitter in human space at the same time. Shorai stared at her screens for a long time, and then she began to analyze. Dig. She pulled deep space sensor data from monitoring stations scattered across the galaxy, arrays that watched the void for unusual energy signatures, and what she found made the feathers on her neck stand straight up. There were movements in the dark, massive, coordinated movements in regions of space that were supposed to be completely empty, energy signatures that were consistent with ship engines, but on a scale that her software flagged as errors, because no species could possibly have that many vessels in places that had never been surveyed. She ran the numbers again and again, and every time they came back the same. And what they told her was that humanity was not retreating or hiding or mourning. They were mobilizing, and they were doing it on a scale that should have been physically impossible for a species that had only been spacefaring for 82 years. She estimated a fleet numbering in the tens of thousands. She compiled her findings into a report and presented it to the Communion Intelligence Council, a body made up of senior analysts from a dozen species who sat in a dim room and listened to her with the kind of polite attention that told her they had already decided not to believe whatever she was about to say. She showed them the data, the sensor readings, the communication blackout, the energy signatures, and she told them plainly that humanity was preparing for war on a scale that the galaxy had not seen in thousands of years. The Council's senior director, a Grellian with 6 arms and a permanent expression of mild boredom, told her that her sensor calibrations were clearly off and that humanity did not have the industrial capacity to build a fleet of that size, even if they had started the day they achieved spaceflight. High Arbiter Kelvothon was called in to review her findings personally, and he looked at her data with his compound eyes clicking softly. Then he patted her on the shoulder with one of his great armored limbs and told her in a voice full of condescending warmth that she was young and talented and that her passion was admirable, but that she needed to learn the difference between data anomalies and genuine threats. He told her to recalibrate her sensors and to take a few days off. Shorai left the council chamber with her report tucked under her wing and a burning sensation in her chest that she would later recognize as the feeling of being right about something terrible while everyone around her refused to see it. She could not go to her superiors, and she could not go to the council, and she could not go to the arbiter. So she went to the only person in the galaxy who she thought might listen. She found Vorathi Sal in his quarters on the station, a dim room filled with the soft hum of machines that kept his ancient body alive. And he was sitting by a viewport, watching the stars the way someone might watch an old friend who was slowly dying. She showed him her data, and he looked at it with those deep dark eyes that had seen 11 billion years of galactic history, and he was not surprised. He was not surprised at all. They are not building this fleet now, child, he said, and his voice was gentle in the way that only someone who has watched entire civilizations die can be gentle. They have been building it since the day they first looked up at the stars and realized the universe did not care whether they lived or died. They decided to make it care. He told her that he had watched species like the Thari 1,000 times before, proud and powerful and absolutely certain that their strength made them safe. And he told her that every single one of them had made the same mistake, which was believing that because they had never been challenged, they could never be defeated. He told her that humans were not like any species the galaxy had encountered, not because they were stronger or smarter, but because they had been forged in a crucible that no other intelligent species had survived. And the thing that had come out of that crucible was something that could not be measured by fleet sizes or weapon yields. It could only be understood by looking into their history and seeing what they had done to everything that had ever tried to destroy them. Shorai asked him what would happen now, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he rose from his chair, slowly and painfully, and he told her that he would make one final attempt. He transmitted an open-channel message to every species in the communion, broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, so that no one could claim they had not heard it. And his words were simple and direct, in the way that only someone who has run out of patience for diplomacy can be. He told them to withdraw from human space immediately, to return everything they had taken, and to apologize for what they had done, without pride or hesitation. He told them that they were not the predator in this story, and that they never had been, and that there were some fires that once lit could not be put out, and that this was one of them. His message went out to 4,000 civilizations, and 4,000 civilizations heard it, and not a single one responded. Grand Admiral Uthanar of the Theri Dominion heard the message aboard his flagship, as he led the largest military deployment in his species' history toward the border of human space. 12,000 warships, arranged in perfect formation, bristling with weapons that had crushed rebellions on 100 worlds. He smiled when he heard the elder's words, and he turned to his officers and told them that the old fossil had lost his mind, and that the humans would see this armada and surrender before a single shot was fired, because that was what inferior species did when they saw real power. His officers laughed, and their laughter echoed through the bridge of a ship that would not exist in 3 weeks. 3 days later, the deep space sensor arrays along the Thari border detected something emerging from fold space, and at first, the operators thought it was a glitch, because the signature was too large to be real, and they ran diagnostics and rebooted their systems, and the signature was still there, and it was growing. When the arrays finally resolved the image, the operators saw a wall of ships stretching across the entire border, not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands, moving in perfect coordination, emerging from places that had never appeared on any galactic chart. The tactical display on the bridge of Grand Admiral Uthanar's flagship turned red from edge to edge, and the admiral stared at it for a very long time without speaking. And for the first time, in a career that spanned 40 years and dozens of victories, he felt something cold settle in his chest like a stone, dropped into still water. Somewhere far away, Vorethi Sol closed his eyes and waited for the sound of the galaxy, learning a lesson it should have learned a long time ago. The first thing Grand Admiral Uthanar noticed about the human ships was that they were ugly. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy built their warships with at least some consideration for beauty. The Thari vessels were sleek and golden, the Velesi ships were curved like wings in flight, even the brutal Grelian dreadnoughts had a certain savage elegance to their design. But the human ships looked like they had been built by someone who cared about only one thing, and that one thing was killing. They were dark and angular, and covered in weapon arrays that jutted out at harsh angles, and their hulls were thick and layered with armor plating that looked like it had been bolted on by hands that were in a hurry. And they moved through space not with grace, but with purpose, the way a predator moves when it has already decided that its prey is going to die. The Wrath fleet had arrived, and it stretched across the border like a wall built from rage and metal. 82 years of silent preparation. Uthenar was not a fool, and he was not a coward. He had commanded the Thari military through dozens of conflicts, and he had won every single one of them. And he believed in his ships and his soldiers, and the doctrine that had made the Dominion the greatest military power in galactic history. He ordered his fleet into battle formation, 12,000 warships arranging themselves into the precise geometric patterns that Thari tactical doctrine prescribed, each ship knowing its position and its role and its target. And then he gave the order to fire. The first volley was enormous, a coordinated barrage from thousands of ships that lit up the void like a second sun, and it should have devastated anything in its path, because Thari weapons were the finest in the galaxy and Thari gunnery was legendary. And this was the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled by his species. The human fleet did not try to dodge or deflect the barrage. Instead, they did something that made no sense to Thari tactical thinking at all. They scattered. In an instant, the wall of human ships broke apart into thousands of smaller groups that spread in every direction at speeds that should not have been possible for vessels of their size. And the Thari barrage passed through empty space where a fleet had been moments before. And before Uthenar could process what had happened, the human ships had reformed into attack patterns that no Thari strategist had ever seen. They came from every angle at once, above and below, and from the flanks and from behind, pouring through gaps in the Thari formation that the Admiral had not even known existed. And they hit with weapons that the galaxy had never encountered. The first was something the human soldiers would later call a gravitational lance, a beam that seized a ship in a focused gravity field so intense that the vessel collapsed in on itself like a piece of paper, being crumpled by an invisible hand, crushed into a dense sphere of metal, no larger than a transport pod, and the sound it made over the communication channels, a shrieking groan of twisting alloys and shattering systems, was something that would haunt Thari survivors for the rest of their lives. The second was a Cascade warhead, a missile that did not destroy a ship's shields, but instead turned them into a feedback loop that converted the shield's own energy into a wave of force that tore the vessel apart from the inside out, which meant that the stronger a ship's shields were, the more violently it died. The third was the EMP swarm, clouds of tiny drones that descended on Thari ships like insects and drained their electrical systems in seconds, leaving warships dark and blind and drifting, and the crews inside could do nothing but float in the blackness and listen to the sounds of the battle they could no longer see. But it was not the weapons that broke the Thari. It was the way the humans fought. Every species in the galaxy followed the Communion's rules of engagement, a set of traditions and protocols that governed how wars were conducted. And these rules said that fleets formed lines and exchanged fire, and negotiated surrender thresholds, and treated warfare as a terrible but organized affair, with boundaries and limits, and an understanding that the goal was to win, not to annihilate. Humans did not fight like that, and they had never fought like that, because their entire history was the history of a species that had survived by fighting things bigger and stronger and faster than itself. And the way you survive that kind of fight is not with honor or protocol, but with cunning and savagery, and an absolute refusal to die. They used ambush and misdirection and feints that drew Thari squadrons into kill zones, where they were surrounded and destroyed in minutes. They sacrificed damaged ships by ramming them into Thari command. Vessels at full speed, they hacked Thari communication frequencies and broadcast the screams from Kepler's reach on every channel, so that every Thari soldier heard the sound of dying children while they fought. It was psychological warfare on a level that the galaxy had never seen, and it shattered the morale of soldiers who had been trained to fight structured, predictable battles against enemies who followed rules. The Battle of the Crimson Threshold lasted 11 hours, and when it was over, Grand Admiral Uthanar had lost 8,000 of his 12,000 ships, and the humans had lost 900. And the Admiral stood on the bridge of his damaged flagship, staring at a tactical display that was almost entirely red, and gave the order that no Thari commander had ever given in the entire history of the Dominion. He ordered a full retreat. What followed was not a war. It was a reckoning. The Wrath Fleet swept through every system that the Thari had seized, moving with a speed and coordination that the Communion's military analysts would later describe as impossible, and then quietly revised to unprecedented when they realized it had actually happened. Colony after colony was liberated, and at each one the pattern was the same. The human fleet would arrive, and the Thari garrison would be given exactly one chance to surrender. A single transmission that said, "Lay down your weapons, and you will not be harmed." And most of them took it, because word had spread about what had happened at the Crimson Threshold, and the Thari soldiers were no longer fighting for pride or empire, but simply trying to survive. Those who did not surrender were destroyed so completely that there was nothing left to bury. Captain Jonah Marin was on the ground when the Liberation Force reached Kepler's reach, standing in the same street where 47 people had been murdered, and he watched the Thari garrison commander walk out of their occupied children's hospital with his arms raised and his mandibles trembling. The commander knelt on the ground where the blood of children had stained the pavement, and around him the colonists gathered in silence. No cheering, no celebration, no shouts of victory, just a quiet crowd of people watching the end of something terrible, with eyes that were too tired and too hurt for joy. Overseer Kreth was found hiding in a supply room, and when a human officer pulled him to his feet and asked if he had anything to say, Kreth looked at the officer with compound eyes that were wide with a terror so deep it seemed to have rewritten something fundamental in his brain. "We did not know," he whispered, and his mandibles clicked in a rhythm that the translation software identified as involuntary distress. "We did not know what you were." The officer looked at him for a long moment, and then said quietly, "We tried to tell you." Across the galaxy, the Communion descended into chaos. Species that had voted for the Accord scrambled to distance themselves from the Thari. Alliances that had stood for centuries dissolved overnight. Emergency sessions were called where delegates shouted at each other and blamed each other and desperately tried to pretend they had not been part of the decision that had started all of this. Analyst Shorai's original report was finally pulled from the archives and read aloud to the Intelligence Council, and the room went completely silent when they reached her estimate of the human fleet's size, because she had been exactly right, and every person in that room had told her she was wrong. The Thari Dominion, broken and desperate, formally requested a ceasefire. The response came not from an ambassador or a diplomat, but from Director Lena Vasic herself, appearing as a holographic projection in the Thari Command Center. And she was exactly as the intelligence files described her, a small woman with gray hair, dark eyes, and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. She did not shout, and she did not threaten, and she did not gloat, and somehow that made everything she said more terrifying than any weapon the humans had fired. "You killed our children," she said. "You occupied our homes. You laughed when we asked for peace. A ceasefire is not what this is. You will withdraw from every system you have ever claimed within 200 light-years of Sol. You will dismantle your forward military installations. You will pay reparations to every family harmed by your occupation, and you will do all of this because the alternative is that we keep coming, and I promise you, you do not want to see what happens when we stop being restrained. The Thari Dominion accepted every single term. 1 year after the Battle of the Crimson Threshold, the conclave of ascended voices reconvened, and the galaxy that gathered in that ancient chamber was not the same galaxy that had gathered there before. The Thari Dominion, which had been the supreme military power for longer than most species had been spacefaring, was a shadow of what it had once been. Its fleets were shattered, its economy was crippled by reparations, its allies had abandoned it, and Fleet Marshal Saravan Cole had been removed from his position and exiled to a frozen moon on the edge of Thari space, where he could contemplate his golden medals in silence. High Arbiter Kelvathan had been replaced as well, voted out by a communion that needed someone to blame, and he sat in the gallery now as an observer, a towering insectoid who had once commanded the attention of 4,000 civilizations, and now commanded nothing at all. And every time a delegate glanced at him, they looked away quickly, as if his failure might be contagious. The balance of power had shifted so completely and so quickly that the political maps had to be redrawn, and at the center of that shift was a species that most of the galaxy had considered insignificant just 2 years earlier. Humanity had not rejoined the Galactic Communion. Instead, they had done something that no one had expected, and that many found far more unsettling than the war itself. They had built something new. They called it the Sol Compact, an independent alliance centered on Earth that included not just human systems, but a dozen smaller species who had been victims of communion exploitation for centuries. Species that had been taxed and marginalized and treated as inconveniences by the larger powers, and who had watched humanity stand against the Dominion and seen in it something they had never dared to hope for. The Compact's message to the galaxy was simple and clear. We will trade with you, we will talk with you. We will cooperate on matters of mutual benefit. But we will never again place our sovereignty or our survival in the hands of an institution that values politics over justice. It was not a threat, but it was not a request either, and the galaxy understood the difference. Ambassador Tyrell Nix returned to the conclave on this day, walking through the same doors she had walked out of 1 year earlier. And she walked the same path through the same chamber, past the same seats, filled with representatives of the same 4,000 civilizations, and not a single one of them was laughing. She had been invited as a guest, formally and humbly, by the new High Arbiter, and she walked to the speaker's platform with the same straight back and calm dark eyes that she had carried the last time she stood here. But everything else had changed. The chamber was so quiet that the sound of her boots on the floor echoed off the distant ceiling. Victory. She did not speak of power or strength, or the human war machine that had dismantled the galaxy's greatest military in a matter of weeks. She spoke of grief. She said the names of the 47 people who had died on Kepler's Reach, every single one of them, and she said them slowly and clearly so that every being in the chamber could hear. And when she said the names of the 13 children, her voice did not break, but something in it shifted in a way that was worse than breaking. It became hollow, as if those names had carved out a space inside her that could never be filled again. She told the conclave that humanity had not wanted this, that the fleet they had built and the war they had fought had cost them something that could not be measured in ships or soldiers or credits. It had cost them a piece of themselves that they would never get back. She said that the rage was real, that it lived inside every human being like a second heartbeat, that it had been there since the beginning of their species, since the first human ancestor had been cornered by a predator on a savanna that wanted them dead, and had decided that dying was not acceptable. And she said that this rage frightened them too, that humans spent their entire history building civilizations and art and music and philosophy, not in spite of the fire inside them, but because of it. Because they knew that if they did not channel it into something beautiful, it would consume them. She said that the galaxy had forced them to let it out, and that the galaxy had seen what it looked like, and that she hoped with everything she had that the galaxy would never make them do it again. She ended with words that would be carved into the wall of the conclave chamber the following year, placed there by a unanimous vote of every delegation present. "We are not your enemy, but we will never again be your victim. Remember that." She stepped down and walked out, and this time no one removed her chair, because there was no chair to remove, and the silence she left behind lasted for a very long time. In the weeks and months that followed, the galaxy began the slow and painful process of reckoning with what had happened. Analyst Shorai was promoted, not just promoted, but given command of a brand new division within the Communion's Intelligence Bureau, a department dedicated entirely to understanding humanity. And she was given unlimited resources and a staff of the brightest minds from 100 species. And she was told that the galaxy could never again afford to be surprised by what humans were capable of. She did not begin her work with military analysis or fleet assessments or weapons research. She began by reading human poetry. She spent weeks going through the collected literature of a species that had been writing since before most galactic civilizations had discovered fire. And what she found in those pages made her weep in a way that her colleagues found confusing, because Valesi did not typically cry over words on a screen. She found a species capable of producing beauty so profound that it made her chest ache. Songs about love and loss, and the desperate fragile hope that life might mean something. Paintings that captured light in ways that her avian eyes had never imagined. Stories about kindness and sacrifice, and the belief that even in a universe that did not care about them, they could choose to care about each other. And she found alongside all of that beauty a darkness so deep that it took her breath away. A history of wars so savage that entire civilizations had been erased, of cruelty so inventive that it defied understanding, of a capacity for violence that was woven into every chapter of their story, like a thread that could not be removed without unraveling everything else. She realized that the tragedy was not that humanity had this darkness inside them. The tragedy was that the galaxy had provocation enough to see only that darkness, and never the light. Captain Jonah Marin retired from military service the day the ceasefire was signed, and returned to Kepler's Reach, to the colony where he had stood at a window, watching the occupation begin, and wondering how it would end. He did not give interviews, and he did not attend ceremonies, and he did not accept any of the medals that Earth tried to give him. He simply went home and began helping to rebuild the children's hospital that the Fari had seized, working alongside colonists who had survived the massacre, carrying materials and laying foundations with his own hands, because there was something about the physical work that helped quiet the noise in his head. He never talked about the war, and the people around him understood without being told that some things are too heavy to carry and too important to put down, and they let him work in peace. Story belongs to the one who saw it coming before anyone else. Vorethi Sal sat in his quarters aboard the conclave station, surrounded by the soft hum of machines that had been keeping him alive for longer than most stars had been burning. And he watched the stars through his viewport, the way he had always watched them, with patience and wonder, and a sadness so old that it had become a part of him like bone. A young aide, a Kaluni born only a few million years ago, entered the room and asked the elder if he was satisfied, if the galaxy had finally learned the lesson he had tried to teach it. Vorethi was quiet for a very long time, and the only sound was the slow rhythm of his life support systems and the distant hum of a station that held the representatives of a galaxy that had been humbled. Then he spoke, and his voice was like the last wind of a dying season, soft and final, and carrying the weight of everything he had ever seen. Years I have lived. I have seen empires that spanned 100 galaxies crumble into silence. I have watched gods die and stars go cold. And in all that time, across all those eons, I have never encountered anything quite like them. He paused, and the stars outside his window burned on without caring. They are terrifying, yes, but not because of their rage. Every species has rage. Humans are terrifying because their rage has memory. It remembers every wound, every slight, every broken promise, every child lost, every hand extended in peace that was slapped away. It passes the memory from parent to child, like a sacred flame that never goes out. He turned from the window and looked at his aide with eyes that had watched the birth and death of civilizations beyond counting. Other species forget. Other species forgive. Humans do neither, not truly. They carry it all, every scar and every kindness, and they wait. And when the time comes, they remind you of every sin you thought they had forgotten. He closed his eyes. The galaxy did not heed my warning. Perhaps now it will remember theirs. Outside the stars burned on, ancient and indifferent and eternal. The same stars that had watched a small blue world spin around an unremarkable yellow sun, while the creatures on its surface learned to turn their suffering into strength, and their rage into something the universe would never forget. The galaxy had been warned. It had not listened.